What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, are you concerned about rising state authoritarianism? Then you're going to want to listen closely to an undercovered story that emerged out of Houston, Texas earlier this week. One in which more than 100 police officers, by some accounts, attempted to intimidate witnesses and legislators voting on whether to expand the county police budget. Some background. On October 11th, a budget hearing was scheduled in Harris County, Texas, at which community members were able to speak in person or virtually to weigh in on local funding issues. Part of the deal was a huge new law enforcement package that would fund 500 new officers and provide raises for all law enforcement. For context, there has been no defunding of the police in Harris County. To the contrary, there's actually a law on the books in Texas which prohibits state counties with over 1 million people from lowering police funding without putting such a budget proposal to a vote. Police funding has been on the rise, with $1.3 billion going to law enforcement in 2022, increasing to $1.4 billion in 2023. That accounts for 64% of the total budget, more than public health, transportation, economic opportunity, and the environment combined. The day of the hearing, according to witnesses present, quote, every inch of the corridors and the commissioner's courtroom was lined with law enforcement officers. An organizer with a local prison advocacy group tweeted that deputy in charge intentionally packing the room with uniforms and telling the non-uniformed officers to stay out of the room. Friend of the show, Alec Katsanis, founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps, added further context, noting that this type of police intimidation happens all over the country and targets witnesses, advocates against police violence, and legislators voting on expanding police budgets. He explained, it's a crime in many places to use government resources, like salary, uniforms, and overtime, for political campaign purposes, such as to promote or oppose a piece of legislation. This crime is never enforced by the police against themselves. Katsanis argues that this behavior is not only chilling, but fraudulent and even fascist. Yesterday, my co-host Robbie took issue with students at the University of Florida peacefully protesting prospective college president Ben Sasse because he does not believe in abortion rights or equal rights for gay students. Sasse's speech was not shouted down. The protest happened some distance away from where he was offering remarks, and yet the perceived chilling effect of the students exercising their protest rights was broadly framed pretty negatively. Now in Texas, uniformed and clearly armed officers of the state have crowded a public hearing, inappropriately using publicly provided clothes and guns to advance a political agenda that should be determined not by threat, but by democratic means. Is this the cancel culture we should really be concerned about? The conclusion of that meeting, well, it had to end early because the 31-year-old chief county executive was dealing with a significant illness and had attended the meeting against the advice of her doctor. As she left, unable to sustain through the planned duration of the hearing, the cops present, well, they booed her and jeered at her. Katsanis notes that police funding is at a record high in Houston. Police, he says, are gorging themselves on overtime, surveillance tech, military weapons, and fraud, waste, and abuse. Meanwhile, this year, more than 20 people have died in the jail downtown Houston alone. They still demand more funding, even though, again, 64% of the city budget already goes to police. Shouldn't they have to prove they'll do something more productive with the budget? Something other than intimidate city government workers? Something other than abuse citizens they're supposed to be protecting and serving? In 2019 in Houston, a judge doubled a woman's bail because she said, yeah, instead of yes at her bail hearing. Is this the abusive system we should fund? Bail is intended to make sure people show up for court dates, not be a punitive measure that makes poor people who have not been convicted of any crime stay in jail while their wealthy peers get to sleep in their own beds. Just yesterday, we saw a cop gun down a 17-year-old simply eating a burger in his car. Thankfully, that cop has been fired and arrested by his own department, but regretfully, that's a rare outcome in a country where qualified immunity and other factors often curb police prosecutions. Uvalde was in the news again this week after the school district fired another police officer under investigations over her actions during the shooting. What actions? Well, she was caught on camera saying that if her son had been inside the classroom with the shooter, she would not have been outside. She would have gone in. Instead, as we know, the Uvalde police prevented parents from trying to do exactly that.
Let us do this, man. Let us do this, man. Come on.
Let us do this.
It's Hood News.
We need to get everybody back.
It's already been about an hour and they still can't get the kids all out.
This new video shows parents trying to storm the school themselves as police try and hold them back. It's estimated once the shooter gained entry, he was inside the building for 40 minutes to an hour before being shot by Border Patrol agents.
Still, months later, it's brutal to watch. And still, despite these errors and despite not actually lowering crime, and both corporate parties seem to want to waste more taxpayer dollars on cops with no accountability. As we look at the phalanx of officers using government money to undermine democratic processes in Houston, we have to ask, who is going to police the police? So yeah, those images were pretty stunning and went kind of viral earlier this week. And it's a kind of small, relatively local story that doesn't usually get that much traction out of the area. But I thought it was an interesting counterpoint to some of the protests that aren't kind of state-backed, that are students in designated zones and free spaces, saying their piece, to something like this, where you have hundreds of or at least 100 officers armed, standing in the hallways, packing the room so that other community members aren't even able to get a spot. I mean, what do you make of this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say that I think that's entirely inappropriate. And no, I don't want to see armed police officers protesting in such a way that makes local officials feel like you better get us what we want, or be a shame if anything went wrong, etc. A kind of thing, which some police, of course not all police, most police are doing a fine job, I'm sure, but there are bad apples certainly in the police departments, and there are some departments that are just rotten to the core, as we saw in Uvalde, in which the entire department, the entire response was completely indicted as absolutely unacceptable, criminally negligent, and calls into question certain types of police funding that I very much that I'm very skeptical of. Right? I try to scrutinize, including the funding for SWAT-style, military-style gear, which seems totally unnecessary in most contexts, and then even in contexts where maybe it would have been useful, is not used, is not put to good use.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was so much really positive bipartisan work happening on criminal justice reform. Weirdly, under Trump, they had like Van Jones in the mix, and there seemed to be some appetite for it. And it continues to strike me as so bizarre that after the enormous support that the George Floyd uprising got initially, I mean, in the early days of the protest, you had polls that showed the majorities of Americans supported burning down the Minneapolis police station. I mean, people that were that committed to the idea that something needed to change. And after that summer of protest, the Democratic Party turned its back on those protesters. Obviously, the Republican Party wasn't interested in meeting their needs. And Joe Biden basically said, you got to shut up and vote for us no matter what. We're not doing criminal justice reform. We're not doing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And part of the fight there was over qualified immunity. And I wonder where, especially after now we have these moments like Uvalde, and public opinion seems to be shifting somewhat about what to do about the police. There was a poll that I cited yesterday in my radar in which conservatives, Republicans in LA support defunding, as long as you don't use that word. They support taking police funds and putting it more toward these other kind of social services. Do you think there's going to be, is this a moment for another like bipartisan round of police reform? Yeah,
there was bipartisan efforts led by Senator Rand Paul on the Briahna Taylor stuff. It's supporting limiting, I think, and that's a very popular thing to do, is limit no-knock raids in the middle of the night for, especially on, for they have the wrong house, or it's for some pointless drug conviction no one really thinks should be a matter for the police anyway. I would like to see more concentration on those issues, particularly now that Biden correctly and thankfully is moving toward more of a decriminalization mindset toward marijuana, toward rescheduling it. Maybe we can reduce police enforcement of those things, and then have more resources left over to deal with what is really everyone's concern, which is the crime issue in some jurisdictions. Violent crime, shoplifting, not not banging down people's doors in the middle of the night because they're under suspicion for something.
Well, yeah, shoplifting is certainly a crime of poverty. So part of that redistribution, the efforts is to say, to get at the root causes of a lot of these kinds of things. So I agree there. Look, if conservatives want to get to the left of the left with respect to the war in Ukraine, I would welcome a world where conservatives start to lead on some of this criminal justice stuff. If Biden wants to double down as Crime Bill Joe, that opens up a wide lane for Republicans to occupy.
I'm sure there's a lot of, I know it's true in Kentucky, I'm sure it's true in a number of states that in practice, Republican legislatures at the state level have, I'm sure, cut police budgets more so than Democrats have in a variety of places. I know it to be a fact in certain states. I don't know overall, I don't know who has defunded police more. It would not surprise me if it was Republican legislators, to be clear.
No, that's a radar, Robbie.
Well, thank you for that, Briahna. And we'll have more Rising right after this.